Hey friends, I've got a different kind of video for you today. A couple of months ago, Into the Weeds podcast commissioned me to do a painting of Quanah Parker in his star house. I was super excited about this because, as y'all know, I tell you all the time, I am a Missouri girl deeply. However, for personal and professional reasons, I've occasionally lived out of state and I've lived near New Orleans. I absolutely loved that. That's one of the reasons why I don't understand Ken's attitude about living in Louisiana, but whatever. But I've also spent time living in Oklahoma, and that is where Quanah Parker is from, where his Star House currently resides. And we're going to get into that. It's a bit of a sad situation with the Star House, but let's get started. So before we get right into the painting, I want to show y'all something. So you may not recognize the name Quanah Parker if you're not super into Native American history, specifically the Comanche Nation history. However, you probably will recognize this character here known as Stands with Fist from Dances with Wolves. Her story in that movie was based on Cynthia Ann Parker, who was Quanah Parker's mother. Cynthia Ann is a white woman who was captured by the Comanche Nation around 1827, and she assimilated and did marry the chief. And interestingly, even though polygamy was the norm in the Comanche Nation, the chief remained monogamous with Cynthia Ann. She had children with him. She had two sons. Quanah was one, and a daughter. Before, in 1860, there was a battle known as the Pease River Massacre, and federal rangers, Texas Rangers, went into the Comanche settlement and killed many people, and they captured Cynthia Ann back to her white family, and she didn't want to be there. She never knew whether or not her sons lived, and they did capture her daughter back with her. Cynthia Ann, eventually her daughter died of flu, and when she did, Cynthia hunger striked. She just stopped eating and decided to die too. She always mourned her Comanche family and never wanted to be back in the white settlement. I started out as usual with a quick chalk sketch and then stabilized it with some really thinned out gesso to like stabilize the chalk dust on there so that that doesn't work around into your paint. We don't want that. Let's show the process. So Amber specifically requested she wanted the painting all done in sepia tones except for the red roof of the Star House, which I think turned out super cool. Now to share a little more information, so Quanah Parker, he was a war leader of a Comanche band, and they were fighting the US government from forcing them onto a reservation type situation and into assimilation. He was fighting that really hard, and that's one of the reasons why when his mother was taken, she didn't know if him and his brother lived because they were part of the war band that was fighting the federal government from forcing them into subjection. The thing that, oh, it's also important to know that his mom, Cynthia Ann, she was 8 years old whenever she was first abducted to the Comanche Nation. And that's why she was so well assimilated and really had a hard time and never assimilated back into her white family settlement after she was taken back by the Texas Rangers. So what actually caused Quanah and his war bands to surrender was the hunting of the bison to almost extinction because that was their sustenance. Without that, the fight probably would have went on a lot longer. And they were moved to a reservation at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Now, Oklahoma, as I'm going to show y'all here in a minute, was doing things a little different at the time than the rest of the nation. And so the Comanches, as a nation, never actually had their own reservation, and I'm going to have a historian that's going to talk about that in another video here in a minute. I'm going to show clips. He did an interview on the Joe Rogan experience, and from what I understand, Joe Rogan does not copyright strike people for using his stuff. Someone tried doing that on his behalf at once, and he was like, no, I'm getting paid. People are free to use my stuff. So just putting that out there. Let me move to a new screen here. So another interesting thing about Quanah is he was considered kind of controversial at the time because he was never actually elected as chief by his people. He was appointed by the federal government as principal chief of the entire Comanche Nation after the surrender to Fort Sill. He became an emissary for indigenous people to the United States government, and that's one of the reasons why the Star House becomes so important because not only was Quanah himself a very cool, important historical figure, but a lot of amazing historical figures came to him at that house to negotiate for things on behalf of the federal government with the Comanche Nation, and also different prominent artists, writers, things like that, just wanting to visit Quanah and be a part of that history. Another thing about Quanah that's considered kind of controversial that I find extremely cool, he did encourage the Christianization of the Comanche people because he believed that having that foundation was necessary. He believed that assimilation was important. Once he stopped fighting, he took on the mindset that the Comanche people needed to educate themselves and learn how to live with the white people. And I believe his mother had a huge impact on him with that personally. And some of this is just me surmising. I'm not the only one to come to these conclusions, but yeah, everyone's got to make their own. But even though he encouraged the Christianization of the Comanche people, he also advocated for a Native American church alternative that people, you can be both. You can be your traditional beliefs, and we can learn to respect and find some solace in these other white beliefs that are coming in. So they did a peyote ceremony. Quanah was really big on the peyote movements and the religious practices. One of his feather fans that he's often shown with is a peyote fan. It's for fanning the peyote fumes. So yeah, we appreciate peyote. Now, interestingly, Lawton is really close to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and he was also elected the deputy sheriff of Lawton in 1902. After his death in 1911, his title, he became known as the last Comanche chief because there was never another leader of the Comanche Nation that took on the title of chief. After that, it was always chairman. I always tell people whenever they're watching my painting process, don't judge by the beginning. You've got to get to the end. It's a process. I know his face is looking a little funny there, but don't worry, y'all. Have faith in me. Now, this is just a random bit of information that I find really cool and interesting, but Quanah Parker's grandpa, the Kawati chief, was known as Iron Jacket. That was what his name meant in English. And the reason why is because he was an early Comanche warrior and was known for wearing a Spanish coat of mail from a previously conquered Spaniard in a Spanish fight, probably one of the not crusaders, but one of the explorers that come over. There's a lot of really fun stories from different tribes and Native American nations that where different pieces of English clothing were found and worn with them thinking that they were actually wearing something that was normal and in style. There was, I can't remember which tribe it was, but they come across some cargo. I believe it might have been in a raid on a train or something like that. But they got a bunch of cargo that was Elizabethan costumes because the raid actually got the cargo of a theater troupe. They were going to be doing like Shakespeare and stuff. So whenever the tribe had a meeting coming up with federal agents for a negotiation and a treaty, they wanted to try and wear more normal English stuff, but they wore the Elizabethan costumes from the raid. And the white people that came for the treaty were extremely confused. I find it just a really fun story. One mistake I really don't want to make whenever talking about this, and I want to be super clear because it as someone who has just had an amateur interest in Native American history but done a lot of studying, it's a little frustrating to me whenever I hear people say the Native Americans, because there are vast numbers of tribes, nations that have their own distinct culture and differences from the other tribes. So, in the past, people in different cities that I spend time in, New Orleans, St. Louis, and stuff, have found out about my interest in artwork and stuff in Native American history and different studies into it that I've done. And they'll say stuff like, oh, did you know that the Native Americans didn't even have a word for ownership? Everything was communal. And it's hard, like, to even begin to refute a statement like that requires giving this person so much foundational knowledge that too often it's just like, okay. Because the Native Americans, like I said, that composes tons of tribes that have their own different culture, language, ways, rules, evolved law, and many of them very, very much do understand ownership. It is not communal property. So yeah, that's just something I wanted to throw out there. So I try to be really specific whenever I'm talking that, we're referring to Quanah Parker and his Comanche Nation when we're referring to this particular Native American history. Okay, I'm going to take a short break from showing you all the painting process to show you what this historian has to say about the Quanah Parker house, because it's a really sad situation that didn't have to be this way.
How long did it take you to research this?
I did this partly while I was at a day gig, so I'm not really sure. Probably 3 or 4 years, something like that. There isn't as much as you would think, because the reason is, I mean, there's a fair amount, and it's all in Texas, which is good. But there's one curious.
You're talking about the research that he did into the history of the Comanche people in Quanah Parker's house.
Thing about writing about Native Americans is that they didn't write anything down.
Just to be clear, he is using the Native Americans here, but if you saw the context of the interview before that, they're specifically talking about the Comanche Nation whenever he says that.
So if you're writing about, say, Winston Churchill, I mean, you can track him from like his bath in the morning to his 7th note to Asquith, and his note to Asquith, to his notes to his wife, to all of his proceedings in Parliament and everything he ever did. It's like moment by moment. You take someone like Quanah out on the plains, and you've got pretty much nothing. And so what you do have are, flashes that are seen by, say, the Spanish originally, or the French, or Mexicans, or Texans and Americans as they come through. You're seeing them in flashes.
What he's saying is important here because he's talking about the early years of the Comanche life before Quanah was taken to Fort Sill. Once he went to Fort Sill, as he acknowledges later on, there's lots of documentation on all of his life because so many people, federal agents, stuff like that, was coming to visit him and negotiate.
As they're presented to you, because there are no parish records, there's no legal records, there's no interviews, there's no things like that.
That's so stunning.
Yeah.
It's so stunning. But that's one of the weirdest things about where they are today in 2019, this idea that they don't have really
as you can tell, this interview is 6 years old, and sadly, Quanah Parker's house is in worse state than ever.
A reservation or specific giant chunk of land that's theirs that they can sort of preserve at least some of this history.
Yeah, no, it's it was a peculiarity of Oklahoma that it went that way, because there are other states, as we talked about earlier, who do have large reservations to this day. But yeah, so it's so, and if you're writing about them, when you get to sort of the post-reservation period, so let's say into the 1880s, 1890s, the world does change in terms of, things are being written down. Quanah becomes a big part of his society. He's setting up cattle leasing deals. He's founding a school board. I mean, he does all these things that, that you wouldn't necessarily think a glorious chief of the.
That's another thing he was considered controversial for, is he was a big promoter in the early days of the Native American residential schools to help their people assimilate, especially on the Comanche Nation. However, Quanah obviously had no idea of the abuses that would be perpetuated through them. So it's important whenever we look at things like that through a historical lens, knowing what we know now, we don't mentally or emotionally indict people for things that they just couldn't have had any way of knowing.
The Comanches would do, but he does those things, and those are very trackable. I mean, you know exactly what he's doing, and you can research them in conventional ways.
I was fascinated by the peyote rituals too. Now, was that a natural?
Joe Rogan's going to be fascinated by the peyote rituals. Like, I don't agree with Joe Rogan on a whole lot whenever, he talks about COVID, like that was crazy, and all of his other stuff. But I do enjoy some of his content, especially whenever he talks about the different DRUG experiments and things like that. It's always an interesting, good time.
normal part of Comanche life, or is this something that he adopted from other tribes?
He adapted it from something that had gone on the border, on the Mexican border, but he became the founder of the Native American church, which had a peyote ritual in which he and it became famous for. And so there was this great a place I would really like to go back to in American history would be to Quanah's house. Quanah got his cattleman buddies to build him. First of all, he wanted the U.S. government to build him a house because Quanah was a hustler, and he said, "Could I please have a house?" And they said, "No, you can't have a house." So he went to his cattleman buddies, and they built him this house.
Quanah was a businessman. Like, he was a war leader and he excelled there. And then once he realized, we don't have the food to keep fighting, we got to change, he became a wheeler dealer businessman. Like you just said, basically a hustler. And I mean that in a good way. Like, he was making stuff happen for his people. I respect the hell out of it.
Magnificent house. It was like 4,500 square feet, double porch with these giant white stars in the roof. It became known as—
Is that his house right there?
That's Star House. It's fallen down, but yes, in its heyday, it looked really—
This is the house we're painting in the background of Quanah Parker's deal, and it's an amazing house, and the state of it, I don't want to cry in this video. I cry about it sometimes.
So that still exists to this day?
It does, and it's about to fall down, and
Who owns it?
This a guy who lives in Cache or Lawton, Oklahoma, and who has been unwilling to accept help or money from everybody from the Comanche Nation to—
That's it right there. It always had the stars on the roof like
yeah,
that?
it did, because he saw that U.S. generals had these stars on their collars, and he wanted like more than they had.
Wow.
I love that. He wanted bigger, better stars than all the people that were visiting him. He was clearly, very symbolic, and that's an aspect of Comanche culture. And I love it. I love that he is like, give me more stars, bigger stars, better stars, more visible stars. I want the best stars.
Wow.
But that sits there in Cache, Oklahoma.
So
now I've been in it, but it's gotten so beat up now that they don't let you go in it anymore. But it sits there. So as long as we have that there, in 1895, if you went there in the, let's say, early 1890s, it would have been one of the most amazing scenes. We had people like Geronimo.
Can you imagine walking into this place in 1895? I've seen pictures of the furnishings, like they were the best of the 1890s stuff. Very, very cool. That bright red roof with them stars, like that would have been pretty well unknown at that time. That would have been like going into a palace, a Native American Comanche palace. I love it.
Coming to dinner. Roosevelt came to dinner. Nelson Miles, the great general, came to dinner. He had I think it was a Swiss Mexican cook. He had 6 wives. He had 19.
That's another interesting thing I find is we know that Quanah Parker's father, after marrying Cynthia Ann, did not go along with polygamy for his personal self, but it was never an issue with the rest of the tribe, and Quanah was polygamous too.
21 children, 19 who grew to adulthood. The house is full of kids. It would have been surrounded by lodges. And the reason it would have been is because his own tribe had come in for help, money or pay for a funeral or going back to the peyote ritual, which is a healing ritual. And so you would have seen one of the great scenes in the American West. And people, when he died in 1911, people found out that he'd given most of his money away. To all these people who had come in asking for his help, he had in fact.
Yeah, people always thought that Quanah was going to leave a massive inheritance. He gave most of it to his tribe, to people in need who just came saying, I need help.
Helped them and given most of his cattle ranching money away that he had made.
Now, this house is owned by one individual?
Yes.
And so, but it's a historical landmark, and no one's preserving it. They're not doing anything to
I don't know all the details of it, but it's owned by Wayne Gibson and his sister, as far as I know, still. And they've owned it for a while.
They don't want any help.
That house was put into an amusement park years ago to preserve.
That's another thing to keep in mind is the house is not in its original location. It was moved. It was literally picked up off its location foundation and moved to where it is now, because this family was creating an amusement park and they bought several historic homes and moved them all to this one location.
Preserve it, that was owned by Wayne's uncle, as far as I know. And
So it was taken apart?
It was it taken apart? I don't know. They did move it, though.
They moved it. So this is not the original location where it's at right now?
No, the original location was out on what turned out to be later to be a Fort Sill gunnery artillery range. And so they moved it. And so Quanah's a daughter, I guess it was, moved it down into Cache. And then it was moved one more time into this amusement park, literally. That when I went into this amusement park, it was like something out of a Spielberg movie. I mean, I was told the house was back there, and I couldn't really believe it. But so we go in, and you're going by these defunct old roller coasters that are all overgrown with vines, like Sleeping Beauty's castle, and there's these cows everywhere, and rides and carousels, all overgrown. And then you go through a series of houses that were also moved there, like Frank James's house or something, and keep going. In the back there, that thing was, the house was sitting there.
Wow.
Can you imagine walking up on that after going through all the creepy, overgrown, abandoned stuff?
Now, it is his. He owns it. He's been approached, as I said, by all sorts of different people, consortiums of people with money who want to buy it or just save it. From literally the Comanche Nation, I know, has wanted to, and Texas Tech has, and some Dallas.
I can't believe he refuses to sell it to the Comanche Nation while sitting there allowing it to fall in.
People and a number of people. And so, to my knowledge, thus far, he refuses to sell or to take their help.
Damn, is that him right there?
Yeah,
I think that is.
Yeah, that's him. Wayne.
Wayne Gibson. Yeah.
Come on,
him.
Wayne.
Hey, so he's a perfectly nice guy. He feels the house is very special in his family, and it is indeed very special. But he won't. The last tour I got with him, as you're going up the main stairwell, there was a 4-foot by 6-inch hole in the main in the roof above the main stairwell. I mean, you can't really have a 4-foot by 6-inch hole.
No.
That might be it.
There it is.
And the rain would just come through. And but so
what can you do to preserve a house like this while still leaving it the way it is?
That's something that's really frustrating to a lot of people. That house is important to the entire Comanche Nation. It's important in American history as a whole, outside of the tribal Comanche Nation history. But this guy feels like his personal failed amusement park family dream is more important than the rest of the nation's interest in this house. And so he chooses to just let it fall down.
So it's, you know what I'm saying? Like, you would have to replace the wood. Now, if you replace the wood, is it still the same house? Like, there's arguments about boats.
Yeah.
They've found some ancient boats, and they've done some rebuilding of these boats. Now, all of a sudden, you're looking at new wood in the shape of this old boat. Like, what is it now?
What is it?
Yeah.
So I tell you, the first time I walked in there, which was 15
This is the real tragedy. Listen to this.
years ago, you wouldn't have needed to do that much work to it.
15 years ago.
Yeah, you would not have needed to. You would have needed some bolstering for sure, and the foundation would have needed some work, but it has gone way downhill because nothing's been done to it. So now I don't know but when I walked in there, you really could have, a good carpenter and carpenter team in a month, you could have shored that thing
Jesus
up.
Christ.
Yeah.
That's so sad.
Yeah, and I don't know.
It's, in a lot of people's opinions, is criminal, and allegedly, because I don't want to get sued. Anyway, let's go back to the painting process. So yeah, it's such a tragedy that, like the guy was saying, 15 years ago he was in, and the main thing would be to fix the hole in the roof, stop the damage from continuing, and then do some recovery and repair. But yeah, apparently it's just being let to absolutely fall in, and it devastates me. It's horrible, y'all. Well, something interesting is, in addition to polygamy that a lot of people aren't aware that the different Native American tribes had normalized, is that divorce was an option too. Quanah Parker initially married an Apache woman early on, but their union didn't last. Now, Quanah, he was initially completely opposed to the opening of the tribal lands for grazing by the white ranchers, the cattle ranchers, but he eventually changed his mind. And once he did, he made close relationships with them, business deals with them, and cattle ranchers are the people who built his star house. So he knew how to work what he needed to work with. You give Quanah lemons, you're going to have the best lemonade ever. So the cattle rancher that built Quanah's house, name was Samuel Burnett. Him and Quanah had a really close friendship. It was reported that he had a really strong feeling for Native American rights as a whole for all tribes, and that he had a really genuine respect. And he's the one who built Quanah's Star House, whereas other ones would, be a bit standoffish and not really understand the Comanche ways. Burnett intentionally learned the Comanche ways. It was really cool. In Quanah, he earned a lot of respect back from the government leaders for his adaptation and the way that he learned to negotiate and get the things that he needed for his people and he learned to do it the ways that he knew were the war party ways. And when he realized they couldn't do that anymore, he learned to do it a new way. He did it through strong negotiating, through alliances, and yeah. Someone notable who visited the Star House was Theodore Roosevelt. In April 1905, he visited Quanah Parker there, and they went wolf hunting together. Now, Quanah wanted the tribe to retain ownership of 400,000 acres that they had grazing rights to, and the government wanted to sell it off to homesteaders. And Quanah fought this, and he eventually lost. It's one of the few times where his wheeling and dealing didn't work out for him. However, there is a wildlife refuge known as Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge. It's along the Texas-Oklahoma border, and President Roosevelt created this, and it's believed that he was inspired to because of his wolf hunt, Quanah Parker. Another interesting thing is that after Quanah Parker was moved to Fort Sill, he got in touch with his white family from his mother's side, and that's really sad because had she lived, she would have been able to know that Quanah lived and what a leader he grew to be. But he got in touch with them, and he actually spent a few weeks living with them with the intention of learning white ways for his assimilation project and his project to, help his tribe. Because all he knew was war ways, and that clearly wasn't going to work when they didn't have the buffalo to sustain him. Oh man, y'all can see I was painting in my robe here. I forgot to push up my sleeve. That was the end of the painting. I hope y'all enjoyed it. Now let's show you the finished product. Here is the finished product. What do y'all think? Let's get Quanah's angles. Some reflection in that direction. I'm gonna have to varnish it still, but it's gotta dry some more. I really hope Amber's happy with it, y'all. Let me know what you think in the comments. What do y'all think? I hope you liked it. I hope you enjoyed the little history lesson. And if you have any thoughts or experiment on it, let me know in the comments.